Welcome, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lowe. I am the Adult Program Coordinator with the Lewis Public Library, and thank you for joining us today. I'm now going to turn this session over to Ronald Collins, the library's distinguished lecturer and editor of Attention, a tri-monthly e-journal dedicated to exploring and illuminating the life and legacy of Simone Weil. So with that, Ron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks to the Lewis Public Library for making this event and so many other events possible, including events that Attention has been able to co-host. Oh, just a little footnote on something. I'm the co-editor with Eric Springstead of Attention. So greetings from Delaware, and welcome to our two guests, one in California, the other in Germany, and also a special shout out to our friends in, among other places, Canada, Italy, Ireland. Yes, there's some folks there in Ireland and elsewhere. So what a joy it is to participate in this event today. I'm Ronald Collins, as Rebecca noted, and I'm delighted to introduce the exchange today between our two esteemed guests. Before I proceed, I just want to mention again that today's event is hosted by Philosophical Investigation and Attention, and this exchange will be recorded and posted on the library website, also in Attention, and it's our hope to have a transcript of it available, so stay tuned. A newly released book titled Private Notebooks, 1914 to 1916, by Ludwig Wittgenstein, inspired today's conversation. That revealing book was edited and translated by Professor Marjorie Perloff. Dr. Perloff is the Sadie Durham Patek Professor Emerita of Humanities at Stanford University. She is the author of 16 books, including Wittgenstein's Ladder, which I recommend highly. I was delighted to read it some years back, and Vienna Paradox. And she will be interviewed today by my friend and colleague, Dr. Mario van der Ruhr from Swansea University. His books and scholarly articles focus on Wittgenstein and Simone Weil, respectively, and he is the editor-in-chief of Philosophical Investigations. With that, Marjorie and Mario, the virtual floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ron, for your kind introduction, and yeah, thanks again to the Lewis Public Library, and of course also to Browse About Books, and in particular to Marjorie for joining us for this event. Quite a fitting event it is as well. We are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the publication of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, and of course your book, your translation of the Private Notebooks, fits right into the discussion, and yeah, I look forward to exploring it with you a bit further, Marjorie. Let me first of all ask you something about your biography, your life. We find out, for example, in Wittgenstein's Ladder that you actually spent part of your childhood in the Bronx. I was intrigued to read that, and you also changed your name from Gabriele to Marjorie as well. And then later on, you obtained a PhD in English from the Catholic University of America. Can you tell us just a little bit more about your biography, your intellectual evolution, as it were?
Yes, thank you very much, ma'am. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you, Ron. Actually, I do talk about my that part of my biography in the Wittgenstein Paradox, this book, which came out in 2004 from New Directions, but people are interested in it now because there's so much interest in that period. I was a refugee. In 1938, my family left Vienna literally the day after the Anschluss. We were lucky to get out via Switzerland and come to the United States. And so I am Viennese, and that gave me some kind of connection to Wittgenstein. I'm not directly related, but, you know, Friedrich Hayek who was a cousin of Wittgenstein's, was a close friend also of my parents. And there was this group in Vienna that my father was in called the Geistkreis, where many of these people met. So it's interrelated, but I'm not a philosopher. And so I feel I'm poaching on other territory in many ways. I have since I wrote Wittgenstein's Ladder. I came to it via poetry, which is really my field of study, modern poetry and contemporary poetry. And that's when I started reading Wittgenstein, when I came across it in the work of so many poets that I was interested in. But the strange thing is that although I hadn't known much about Wittgenstein, it does fit in with my own family history in many ways. That's a very strange world. A lot is being written about it now. The world between the two world wars in Austria. Wittgenstein was born in 1888, and it makes a big difference, really. That was a very intellectual world, and it should be called Austro-Jewish, really, because the culture was so heavily Jewish, and then so many of them left. A lot came to California, I should say, and Schoenberg, Thomas Mann, Brecht. There's the Thomas Mann house right around the corner from me here in Pacific Palisades that has events like this kind of event all the time. And so there's very much interest in this. I think one of the important things that I could contribute was that after all, Wittgenstein is Viennese. He didn't really go live in England until he was 40 years old or so, and in 1930. And when he got the call back to Cambridge, he had lived in Cambridge for a few years, and worked with Bertrand Russell, but he is through and through Austrian, and he always wrote in German. And that's very important to know. So we know him mostly in English translation, and people think he's an Englishman or something. And his English really was never very good. We can talk about that later. It was never quite colloquial, whereas his German is very natural, very colloquial, not highfalutin as it sometimes can sound in these translations that were done very early. He's hard to translate in a way, but it's not just the language, it's also the whole idea that he comes out of that particular Viennese milieu. And I just want to say one thing about that for starters, which is that in Vienna, it wasn't like in Germany where you learned the tradition of Kant, Hegel, through Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, etc. Because in Vienna, in Austria being a Catholic country, there wasn't much philosophy studied. And when philosophy came in, which was only at the beginning of the 20th century, it was mathematical philosophy, and it was logic, and it was not the grand German philosophers. So Wittgenstein was not trained as a philosopher and had never read, he did not read Aristotle. I think he read Plato a little bit. He had read some Kant, but I mean, he did not know Descartes. He did not know, he never formally in any way studied philosophy. So I think that's important to understand. That makes him quite different, say, from Heidegger, whom he has certain similarities to, but German philosophy, Mario, I think it's interesting that it's that Austrian difference, and it is very different, I think. I'll stop there.
Right. Your picture just has frozen. Can you still hear me all right now?
Yeah, I don't notice.
Okay, great. Well, that's the main thing. Yes. When did you? Yeah, thank you so much, Marjorie, for telling us a bit more about your life. And when
you froze.
First becoming.
He froze.
Mario,
in
breaking up a little
work. What was it? Am I? Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe what I will do is temporarily just shut down my camera.
Yes, I was going to suggest that, Mario. You might have some bandwidth issue.
Yeah. Okay then. Okay, how's this now? Can you hear me all right?
Yes, fine.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, yes, I wanted to ask you, Marjorie, when did you first become interested in Wittgenstein's work, and what was it that intrigued you about
Well,
it?
you know, when Wittgenstein says, philosophy should really, die Philosophie sollte man eigentlich nur dichten. Dichten is a verb that's very hard to translate because it can mean write poetry, but it can also mean write prose, dichten, anything imaginative in that sense. But I wrote a book in the late 80s called The Poetics of Indeterminacy, Rimbaud to Cage. And I was already got interested in Wittgenstein because the poets that I was studying had a lot in common with him. First of all, David Anton, who most of you will probably not know, the talk poet, who was a Wittgensteinian through and through. He really sort of started me on it. And then the poet Charles Bernstein, who has a wonderful essay in his first book, Content Stream, called Reading Cavell, Reading Wittgenstein. Stanley Cavell, who was a great American who died recently, Wittgensteinian, and educated so many of the people who now are interested in and cross sort of that field between poetry and philosophy. So I wanted to figure out why Wittgenstein spoke to poets, to filmmakers, to artists, why he was so important for poets like Rosemary Waldrop, Lynn Higini, and many of my favorite poets who were interested in it. So the thing that Charles Bernstein made me very much aware of, this was a great age of deconstruction, is that as compared to Derrida, whom Wittgenstein has certain things in common with, but he's so much better and so much more practical. In other words, as opposed to the Derridian notion that nothing, you know, meaning can always oscillate. Any sentence, anything you say, the meaning, the signifier is always floating, and meaning can oscillate, and so on. Wittgenstein was very practical in the sense that if I'm a native speaker and you're a native speaker and I say to you, pass the sugar, please, you understand me perfectly. There's no problem. So communication is not a problem in that sense. But as soon as you get to larger notions, it is very difficult to know what things mean and how language works. And of course, if you're interested in poetry, language is central. Poetry is the language art. So I think that Wittgenstein is the crucial philosopher for poets and for literary understanding. And I noticed that now in the literature, there are lots of essays coming out in different little magazines and so on by younger people, you know, people in their 20s, pointing out how important, here we're having the anniversary of the Tractatus, 1922, how important Wittgenstein was. So that was my beginning, and I was well aware of the fact that philosophers would not quite approve the standard academic philosophers, and they probably don't. Many of them don't approve, and I have full respect for them and for the things they do, which of course are rather different. But I did feel that I could bring it over into a somewhat different world. So I wrote Wittgenstein's Ladder, which was published in '96, and is a book about Wittgenstein's relationship to writers like Gertrude Stein, who you can understand much better through Wittgenstein than otherwise, Beckett, a very Wittgensteinian writer, Samuel Beckett, especially, and then the German, or rather the Austrian writers, Thomas Bernhard, who wrote the book Wittgenstein's Nephew, lots of material, and Ingeborg Bachmann. Her book Malina has little dialogues that look as if they come out of the philosophical investigations in many ways. So it really was interesting, and I could have used different writers, and some of them I wouldn't use if I wrote the book today, that probably I may have not been quite right, I think, about them. And but it was really fun to do and wonderful to learn, and made a big difference, I think, not just in my work, but for my life. So that's how it all got started.
I sheds a lot of light also on what you describe as the distinctively Wittgensteinian poetics, right, that you mentioned in your earlier book. And Yeah, in connection with Stein, Beckett, and Bernhard, whom you mentioned as well. So in other words, one would actually have to engage with those, with your interpretation, with your reading of those authors, to see what it is that connects them with Wittgenstein's attitude to language. Am I right in putting it that way?
Yes.
Oh, okay, right. And let's see now. In Wittgenstein's letter as well, we keep coming back to this book, which incidentally I think is very lucidly written. I mean, it's marvelous. I was reading the other day the chapters on the Tractatus, the war experience in that book, for example. Very, very clearly presented, Marjorie, I have to say. And well, you say in that book that Wittgenstein's translators have, and here I'm quoting from it, managed to transform his colloquial, idiomatic, and quite natural idiom into the stilted, awkward locutions of the ill-at-ease Cambridge Don, who hasn't quite mastered the decorum of the common room. I like that way of putting it. Now, you rightly point out in your introduction to the private notebooks that Wittgenstein's German is Austrian, and you already mentioned this earlier, which is so different in places from High German that it even requires its own dictionary. Now, did Wittgenstein's colloquial phrasing, to go back to the phrase you use, perhaps together with some of the really archaic military terminology, present a challenge for your translation of the notebooks, or not so much in the notebooks themselves, but elsewhere, where you find, this hasn't been captured in English at all?
Well, the military terms are hopeless because it's just a different military. For instance, as an Einjähriger. In the notebooks, you'll read that Wittgenstein joined. He could have, of course, become an officer coming from the family he did, from this very rich, prominent family, but he didn't. He joined the infantry. Then he later regretted that very much because he was with a terrible group of people that he didn't really get along with. And they said, you could have become an Einjähriger, a one-yearer. Well, we have nothing comparable to that in English. What that meant is if you had passed the Matura, which would be like the French Bac, the end of the high school exam, you could, for a year, be trained with the officers, even though you weren't an officer yet. And so he could have been an Einjähriger. He had passed that Matura, but he didn't do it. But how do you translate that? I had to put in footnotes for some of those things. And even a lieutenant is a very different thing. It was in the Austrian army of that time, more prominent than our lieutenant. So these military terms are hopeless. I did the best I could with them, and it doesn't really matter so much in most cases, except to know that somebody's an officer and somebody's just in the infantry, or they're in the cavalry, which was very prominent in the days of the Habsburg Empire, and so on. But the colloquial part works like this, as I said, that Austrian does have its own dialect colloquialism to some extent. It's rather different from High German. It's like English and American, or let's say Australian and British, and so forth. The language varies. And let me say something about the original translation, because I think that's very important. The translation you're still, if you read it, are using, even with some adaptations by David Pears and so on, is the original translation by Ogden, supposedly Ogden, who worked with Russell, named Ogden. The fact is, though, it wasn't by Ogden. What happened was that Wittgenstein couldn't get it published in Vienna. It's amazing with a book as famous as that, but it's very short. It's a very odd book. And right after the war, in 1919, 1920, he tried to get it published in Vienna, and all the publishers turned it down. It was finally published in a little journal in German. So Bertrand Russell, who was his great mentor, although they then parted ways, said, I'll get it published in England. We'll get it published in English, and I'll write the introduction. And Wittgenstein disliked that introduction very much. He thought it really misunderstood him. But anyway, it got published. And he said, I'll get somebody to translate it. And that was his friend C.K. Ogden, linguist, semanticist, so on. But the fact is, we now know Ogden didn't do it. It was farmed out to Randall, James Randall, who was 18 years old and who was a student at Cambridge, brilliant, and he's the philosopher who died, when he was 30 years old, of great loss, because he was a great philosopher and actually corrected some of Wittgenstein's things. And Wittgenstein met him in Vienna, they talked, and then Randall did it. And Wittgenstein was satisfied with it because his own English isn't that great. This is always the way translations work. So there are many things, though, that are not only not colloquial, I mean, they're kind of wrong in many ways, beginning with the first sentence of the Tractatus, Die Welt ist alles, was der Fall ist. The world is everything that is the case, but we don't talk about things being the case. I mean, we might say the case is that you're wrong about this or so on, but we don't go around talking that way. And it really just means the world is everything that is, everything that is. The world is everything that is. The very last famous sentence, which is usually translated into English as whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Well, who talks that way with these whereofs and thereofs? And the original German is just perfectly straight from it, wovon man nicht sprechen kann, etc. So there is now coming out, and I wrote the preface for it, a new translation. Now that the Tractatus is out of copyright, there will be numbers of new translations. And this one is by the quite famous translator, Damien Searles. And I, sort of was an advisor for that a little bit and helped him with certain things, although he doesn't need much help. He's just translated Thomas Mann's short stories. He's an outstanding translator. And we were both shocked going through it at some of the basic things about atomic facts and so on that are really not quite right, that weren't right. And yet for years and years, everyone has used this translation. It was adapted a little bit by David Pears and another friend and made a little bit more readable. But the fact is that, like many things, this happened with Freud originally too, but not as badly. The translations have been very iffy. I'll just give you one other example. In the Philosophical Investigations, where Wittgenstein defines the language game, he talks about Kreisspiele, which simply means circle games. Nothing difficult about that. Kreisspiele, right? Mario, circle games. Elizabeth Anscombe, who's the translator, and who went to Vienna very briefly, and she certainly didn't know that much German or colloquial German, translates it as Ring Around the Rosie. Well, Ring Around the Rosie is one circle game, but it isn't really the same thing as talking about circle games, is it? So, you have to be careful. And in many cases, not only as far as translating the notebooks, but when quoting the right-hand page of the notebooks, which is the philosophical part, or quoting the Tractatus, I retranslated certain things as best I could, just for clarity's sake, not for beauty's sake or anything, for clarity's sake, because I do think the original translation has a lot of problems. And that remains true of the later works too. It would be wonderful, and I'm sure it'll happen before too long. After all, this is now 100 years ago. The translation is 100 years old. And however good Randall was and Ogden sort of supervised it, it was kind of thrown together, slapped together. So that's the translation that we have in the Rutledge book, which is what most people use.
Right. And I think, Margaret, was the translator you had in mind, was it Frank Ramsey, the mathematician?
Ramsey. What did I say?
Randall, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Ramsey, of course. Frank Ramsey.
Yeah, okay. That's
Frank
great.
Ramsey. There's now a very good book, a biography of Frank Ramsey. Excuse me.
That's right. No, very good. I wanted, as we're talking about translations, I also want to briefly mention the project that's underway at the moment, which has been undertaken by David Stern, Joachim Schulte, and Katja Saporiti. Because what they have decided to do, I think quite rightly as well, is to come up with a unified translation of all the works relevant to the genesis of the Tractatus, including the notebooks, the proto-Tractatus, and indeed the Tractatus itself. And apparently that translation is nearly done now. from what I understand from David Stern. So it's a project that will ultimately end up in the public domain, I think, as a digital project that will make the text accessible to everyone who doesn't speak, I mean, like you and I,
Yes.
read German in the original. So yeah, that is
Yes, I
very
met
much.
David Stern, and it sort of
Yeah.
made me feel I didn't even need to do it because they're
Yeah.
doing a beautiful job. And of course, that will be the scholarly translation. You know,
Yes.
this one was more for the, and of course, once that comes out, you're right, that will be the definitive translation that will replace,
Yeah.
these others and be very important.
Right. Okay, so let's turn then briefly to the notebooks, the 1914 to 16 notebooks. We have several manuscripts, 102, 101, and 103. They were published in 1961, as you point out, and are available today in a bilingual edition under that title, Notebooks, 1914 to 16. Now, the coded left-hand pages have never been published in English, never at all. You say a bit more about this in the afterword, and I think we'll come back to it to discuss the possible reasons for this omission as well. Now, why do you think, if someone said, why are the coded remarks of special interest, both biographically and philosophically? And so that's one part of the question. What is it about them that makes it desirable that they are published in translation? And also, what do you think about Wittgenstein's wartime experiences that are not already conveyed, admittedly much more briefly, in chapter 6 and 7 of Ray Monk's biography, Behind the Lines and at the Front? Because he uses material, doesn't he, from those notebooks, and he gives us an impression of what they're all about.
Yes, those are very good questions. Ray Monk's, I should have said originally that one of the things that also brought me to Wittgenstein was Ray Monk's incredible biography. This is one of the great biographies. There are not so many great biographies, very hard to do, and especially of a philosopher. The reason that Ray Monk's is so remarkable is that he really explains clearly how the philosophy works, how it changes, what the main principles are and doctrines. You have it all laid out there in a beautiful way, relating to the life and very clearly written. I should say there's also the other biography, which is very important, but doesn't go all the way through the life because he died, which is Brian McGuinness.
Yes.
And both McGuinness and Monk have chapters on the war experience where, of course, they quote from the notebooks. And there were many quotes that were very well known. I should say always sort of the same quotes. For instance, the one where Wittgenstein says that the English will win the war because they're a better race. The word race is used, as was used in those days, than we are. And that makes me very sad because I'm German through and through. And that's a quote that's given often. There's certain other quotes that are given often. But of course, it's not the same thing. And McGuinness has even more than Monk has about the war experience with a lot of quotes. But you're getting it kind of at secondhand and not directly. And I thought it would be very interesting directly. I did not originally plan it. What happened was that during the pandemic, I was reading, there was an edition in German, which was then scrapped. And I describe all that because there were certain mistakes, and Elizabeth Anscombe, who was the main executor, was furious about it. She didn't think it should have been published. Geheime Tagebücher in German, die Geheimen Tagebücher. And that already came out in the early 90s and then was scrapped. But I have it here. I didn't, and I said to a friend, my Chinese friend Yunte Wang, who has worked with my editor, Bob Weil, isn't it strange that there isn't any edition in English? And I might actually undertake, I'm not a translator basically, but I might undertake it because it would be useful for people. And the editor at Liverite, whose German is excellent, Robert Weil, was interested in it. So we decided to go ahead with it. And in fact, before I undertook it, Bob Weil had said to me, well, what makes this more than a morsel? I thought, good heavens, what does make it more than a morsel? I had to think it through. But I do think it's important because every scrap, I should say, every scrap of Wittgenstein's philosophy has been published. This manuscript, the next version, the big typescript, So we have all this material but much less on the life, and especially the Austrian part of the life. And I had written about the war already in Wittgenstein's Ladder, and I was very interested in it as, first of all, just as a diary of war experience. We have so many war diaries, but most of them are quite unlike Wittgenstein's, because the typical diary, especially of World War I, is how awful the war is. But my comrades, the British ones, by people like, Sassoon and so on, were all done sort of comrades, the comrades you make during the war, but of course the hatred of war and how terrible the war is and all that. And Wittgenstein really has very little to say about the meaning of the war. Was the war worthwhile? Why in the world was this war fought? What were the consequences? It's not that. It's how he can have courage to fight in the war, and can he make it? Can he do that? Can he sort of pass that test in an odd way? And the war is taken as a kind of given, and far from comrades. He hated most of the people he had to deal with, because they were people he had never dealt with before in his life, coming from this semi-aristocratic, very wealthy family. He was sort of spoiled, so the war changed him a great deal. So I think, first of all, it's an interesting war diary. And secondly, it does tell you day by day what Wittgenstein was thinking, and how the philosophy, which is on the right-hand side, relates to these coded personal remarks, which are written in code. You should all know the code is actually fairly easy to decipher. It's just Z is A, Y is B, X is C, etc. So it's a code he used with his siblings when he was young as a child. And it's not that it's that hard to decipher. And in the Nachlass, which you can read right online, anybody can go to the Nachlass and read it, which comes out of the University of Bergen. This wonderful Nachlass, beautifully done, of course, in German. It's been deciphered, so you can read it just in normal German. Relates to it, and what I did learn that I don't think Monk stresses as much as I would, although he does to an extent, is the book changed completely in midstream. The Tractatus Logico Philosophicus began as a treatise on logic in response to Russell's what Wittgenstein felt was a not quite right treatise on logic. And in midstream, it changes into a book that does deal with large ethical issues without answering them, but large questions of religion and ethics, and it becomes quite a different book. And it's been argued, therefore, how do we then read the earlier part? There's the so-called robust reading that, in fact, he really goes through and gives up all his earlier thinking. I don't think that's quite true. I think all of it is important. But the point is, you actually see that if you read the coded remarks. You also learn a lot about his life. Some people would say too much. Now, to take the second part of your question, why, do you want me to talk about that right now? Why it wasn't published? The original trustees the original executors were Elizabeth Anscombe, Rush Rees, and Franz von Richt, Norwegian scholar. And
Georg Henrik, yeah, that's right. Georg Henrik von Richt,
yeah. And and the only direction Wittgenstein had left them is they should publish whatever they thought was most important. He left behind thousands of pages of manuscript, because the only thing published in his lifetime was the Tractatus and a few small things, lecture on ethics. And the reason for that is that Wittgenstein was always revising. And had he lived and not died of cancer when he did, he would have, I'm sure, kept on revising what became the Philosophical Investigations, which was already in various different states and has now been reprinted with the second part is treated differently, and so on, because he was never satisfied with what he wrote, and he kept revising and changing things. So they had these piles of manuscripts, and the first thing they published was the Philosophical Investigations, which with the Tractatus is Wittgenstein's main book. And then they went from there to the other philosophical works, plus the lectures at Cambridge, which were taken down by students in English and some of them are very important, and those were published. All that's been published long ago. The notebooks were left unpublished, and there are also Cambridge notebooks, which have just come out. There was already an earlier edition, but James Claggy has now, I want to put in real plug for that, has brought out the Cambridge notebooks of the 1930s, which are also very important, just to read these personal remarks and what Wittgenstein had to say about day-by-day things and his sorrows and so on. Now, and then he talks about he doesn't talk about his sex life, but he talks about masturbating, why he felt he had to record that is interesting. It's of course very trivial. Why do we need to know that in order to understand the philosophy? And there are many philosophers who feel that we don't need to know about a philosopher's personal life, that it has nothing to do with the philosophy. Well, I just think that's wrong. And it's not that I'm a biographical critic. I'm usually considered quite a formalist, not dealing with biography. But it's like the case with Heidegger, whom we now know a lot about his personal life, and it does make a big difference, doesn't it? I mean, obviously life makes a difference in somebody's work. And in Wittgenstein's, I do think the life is very important, and you can show it in all kinds of ways in what the philosophy turned out to be. So I thought we do need those remarks, and some of them are very boring, or he'll just say, couldn't work, couldn't work, couldn't work. He was very blocked.
Right.
To get his work done. And by work, of course, he means his philosophical work, not the work on the ship. He spent months on a ship, the Goplana, that just brought material from place to place. It's terribly boring and mostly nothing was going on, but eventually they were shooting. Then he was in Krakow for a period, running the artillery workshop, and finally the artillery train. So very menial and boring tasks mostly. And finally then under fire at the Brusilov offensive, one of the great battles in Galicia. All of it is repeated now in the Ukrainian war. If you want to understand the Ukrainian war, just go back and read about some of those battles, and I have some maps that took place in what would now be Ukraine on the Eastern Front, where Wittgenstein was stationed. The mountains near Galicia, Liev, which has been in the news a lot recently, Lemberg, which was originally called Lemberg, that was all part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the huge empire. So I think it's very interesting to read that and read what he was writing when and how he managed. And then you get actually some of the same phrasing on the left side of the page as on the right. Now, of course, it should all be published together, which David Stern will do. But you know, that it's a much more difficult project. I just did the left-hand side. There were many notebooks that were lost. So there are just 3 that I translated. You can't have the lost ones. So it's a pretty short, it's only about 70 pages, let's say, or 80 pages of manuscript. But I think they're very valuable. Now, why weren't they published? Well, Elizabeth Anscombe was quoted as saying that if I could have, you know, any for a pound or whatever for not publishing Wittgenstein's personal remarks, I would want to do that, because she felt it put him in a less than the wonderful light that they had him in. And there's something about philosophers, it's a little different with literary people or artists or composers, I think, or anybody else, that you don't touch the life and you don't touch anything that might look problematic or whatever, which I really don't quite understand. But it's also true of certain writers. It's true of T.S. Eliot, where there's also much attempt not to reveal his personal life, and he didn't want his personal life revealed. Well, if somebody really doesn't want their personal life revealed, they'll destroy the material. W.H. Auden burned all his letters, got rid of them, so you don't know it. So, but if somebody has not destroyed the manuscript, but Wittgenstein left the manuscript specifically, first of all, to Bertrand Russell, and then to his family, and put, you know, what they were, and his family had them after his, you know, and could call various writers and translators to their home at the Hofrat outside Vienna. That I'm not so sure he didn't want them published, and he certainly didn't destroy them. And there was the feeling, I think, very puritanically among Elizabeth Anscombe and Rush Rees, Franz von Richt was less testy about it and didn't mind so much that none of this material should be published. Because we don't need to know about the personal life. So when Cornell University acquired the microfilm, they put it all on microfilm. They acquired text and put it on microfilm. They had two microfilms, one a sort of full one, and the other with everything in the Nachlass expurgated, so you wouldn't read those things, which I find quite shocking and quite amazing. Now, where were the Austrians on all this? Also very much against it. At Innsbruck, where there is where the Wittgenstein papers are, and many of the papers, and there's a huge archive and a wonderful archive. They don't want to talk about it. They also don't want to talk about it. Now, why? They don't want to talk about the sex life because Wittgenstein was gay. And bear in mind that until 1967, for instance, in England, homosexuality was a crime. So I can see that there was a desire not to talk about it then. And Monk, as great as his biography is otherwise, goes so far as to say, and you asked me about this, Mario, it's one of your questions. Monk said, well, he seemed to be kind of have a difficult time with sex in general, not necessarily homosexuality, just sex in general. I do not believe that's true at all, because Wittgenstein didn't even really pretend. He walked the streets of Cambridge with Frances Warner, who was his lover at the time. This is in the 30s. There are letters coming out now that will be published soon. His letters to Ben Richards. When Wittgenstein was about 50, he fell in love with a medical student named Ben Richards. And those letters are really something. I mean, they're really love letters. They're a little, for anybody read, they're very sad, they're very moving, but now I find, what love really is. And Ben Richards later got married, and I'm not sure how much that was reciprocated. He was a medical student, but they spent a lot of time together. And there's absolutely no question. Also, there is no relation. I mean, women don't figure in Wittgenstein. He was, in a certain sense, misogynist. He called Elizabeth Anscombe an honorary man. He had to admit how brilliant she was, so she had to be an honorary man. But women couldn't, he had really, his life was a male-centered life. He was always with men, his great friends. I don't mean not lovers at all, but just all his friends. And women really played no role, except for one woman who his sister introduced him to, Marguerite Respinger, who he was very attracted to in a certain way, and even thought of marrying. And she would have liked to marry him. He told her that if they got married, it would be a platonic relationship only, because that's all he was capable of, whereupon she absconded, and that was that, and she married somebody else. That is the only woman in his life, and it's not very much really in his life. And I think there can be no doubt about that, but the philosophers don't want to say that. And in Vienna, the various people, they get very angry when it's talked about. It's not quite clear to me why, and it's not something I spend my time doing, outing writers. It's not my métier at all. But I think in his case, it is important, because it meant a kind of loneliness, a kind of sense of being an outsider, which he already was in England as an Austrian at Cambridge. He's doubly an outsider. And the reason it's so important is it relates to his relationship to his family. He didn't really like to spend time with his family. He said he hated to come home at Christmas, where they had their big Christmas feasts and everything. He was embarrassed to be around his family, and yet he loved them. I mean, he obviously really admired his father very much and loved them. Also, Wittgenstein had 3 brothers who committed suicide. 3 of his 4 brothers committed suicide, and 2 of them were definitely gay. We know that. And one of them left a note when he committed suicide in a cafe in Germany, and all 3. So imagine having these 3 brothers, but is it a gene? Whatever it was, that was a fact of the family, and of course, a very terrible. Think about it. Think of what that was like. He was the youngest of the 8 children. So there was Paul, who also was wounded in the war, the one-handed pianist, went to the United States. who was heterosexual, but the brothers. So all this created a kind of certainly kinds of problems that relate to meaning and many of the issues that come up in the philosophy. And just one other point on that. I was once asked to speak because they needed an extra speaker, and this was in Vienna, on Wittgenstein's time in Norway. Wittgenstein had a cottage, it's now been rebuilt really, on a fjord in Norway, and that's where he went to get away from everything and do his work. And you could only get there, it had on a very steep hill, you could only get there by boat and then climb this hill. And he had been there right before the war. And then later on, he would go for a year to 6 months at a time and longer. And one of the big discussions is, well, there he was all alone. Why did he need to be alone and to do his work and write his books and so on? And when I looked into it, I realized he wasn't alone most of the time. He brought with him one of these young men, and they were there with him in the cottage. Francis Warner came for quite a while and helped take down the Tractatus and do the actual, helping him with the actual writing of it and editing of it. And he also knew some of the young men in town. And in the notebooks, for instance, he'll say, "Lovely card from Arnie." And I thought, well, who's Arnie? And, these days you can find anything online if you look long enough. Well, Arnie was a young man, I have his last name here somewhere, who was about 16 years old, who was just the son of the people he first stayed with when he went to this little village. And he deeded the cottage, when he went to war, he deeded the cottage to Arnie. And Arnie had it rebuilt down in the village, and it belonged to him. And so, he knew the young men. It's not clear what went on between them. Was it sexual? Was it just friendship? That doesn't even matter. But the fact is, he wasn't as alone as has been thought. And the person who runs the Norwegian Wittgenstein Society wrote to me, and he said after he looked into it, of course, that was really the case. So that all these years when people kept saying, oh, he's going there to be alone and get away. Yes, he did want to get away from Cambridge. He did not like Cambridge life. He did not like the Don's life and all that. And he found it very tiring and very wearing and so on. And so he did go to the cottage, but it was by no means that he was always alone. Now, they weren't all lovers. He invited G.E. Moore, the great philosopher, who Wittgenstein didn't care for, and said it's amazing how somebody as stupid as Moore could, actually produce these books. So he had little regard for him as a philosopher, but he liked him as a person, and he spent some time there. I'm not saying at all anything between them, but I'm just saying there's an interesting fact that does make a difference. So I do think the notebooks were worth publishing, and reviewers have certainly seemed to feel, yes, you're learning something interesting about it. Unfortunately, as these things do, certain reviewers will then just pick up on the queerness, and Wittgenstein used that adjective all the time, queer. It's funny that that's now become so prominent, but meaning just it's very queer, it's strange, literally meaning that. But it's too bad, the New Yorker, for instance, reviewer picked up on that and made the whole thing a discussion of that. But I certainly don't do that. I mean, I'm much more interested in war, in the attitude toward war. To me, World War I is the interesting war because it's so futile and seems so insane. And the outcome of it has haunted us ever since. Look at Ukraine today. The outcome of World War I is the key thing. So I think anybody who was actually in that war, and to have somebody that notable and a philosopher actually on the front fighting and manning the watchtower and things like that, I think is very important.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marjorie. Just before we go into the discussion session where we have questions from the floor, I just wanted to ask you two more questions if we can fit them in. But first, as we were talking,
if I could interrupt for just a second.
Okay.
Forgive me. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been watching and listening to Marjorie Perloff Unplugged, as it were. And I mean, it has been just an incredible experience. And given your remarkable energy level, if that remains constant, and if you were so inclined, I wanted to just suggest to you and to Mario, we could do one of two things. We could either extend this a little longer, if you care to, that's today, or we can continue, for about another 15 minutes and do a sequel sometime in the coming weeks, whatever you're comfortable with. But I just mentioned that because this exchange is so rich, and I wouldn't want to deprive any of us of the opportunity to have more of it. So, of course, we will turn to questions, but whatever the two of you are comfortable with, let me just throw that out and return the floor to you. And forgive me for interrupting.
Well, we could go on, I think, for another 10 minutes. How would that be, Mario? And then open it up? Could we do that?
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, sure. Okay, then.
So you asked the question, yeah.
Okay, one very quick comment then on what you just talked about, Marjorie. You're quite right. Ray Monk does say Wittgenstein was uneasy not about homosexuality, but about sexuality itself. And of course, reading the private diaries with that question in mind, that's why I asked you whether you think that there is something in those coded remarks explicitly, well, perhaps even implicitly, about his homosexuality rather than sexuality. The reason I'm saying that is because, of course, Ray Monk suggests that Wittgenstein seemed to regard it as incompatible with the sort of person he wanted to be. And I mean, it immediately put me in mind of something Simone Weil said, when she notes that, well, there's nothing surprising about a thirsty man drinking, because that's what thirsty people do. But the interesting and noble ones are those who pour away the water, like Alexander the Great, like the saints, and so on and so forth. And maybe, something like this thought also occupied Wittgenstein. I mean, there were things he was very concerned about, and we'll come back to this when we talk about maybe the time in Norway. But I mean, you suggest, of course, that in your translation, or rather in the comments, that Wittgenstein records frequent trips to the baths and to a cafe in town, but never confides more than these facts even to his private diary, right? And well, I caught myself then speculating, reading your description. It's true that the baths are mentioned 5 times in the coded entries, but I mean, it's things like gebadet or abends im Bad, which means I had a bath. I
don't believe that.
You don't believe that at all, really?
No, I've asked various friends and they just laughed. And they said, that's just a coded phrase for when I have sex. He goes into Krakow. And don't forget also negatively, I'm sure all the people on the ship, his shipmates, who are mostly pretty crude people from the then Yugoslavia. They drafted these people from Serbia. Most of them were illiterate, whatever. I'm sure they raced into town to find women as soon as they got off the ship. And of course, he never did that. And there's absolutely no interest in that and all that. And I think it's clear about the baths. There are also remarks like there was a Captain Adam, and he said problematic with Captain Adam, and it may lead to a duel, and where he's very troubled. But he isn't going to say so because one didn't talk about these things. You see, and that I do feel also coming from my family, a Viennese family, lots of sex obviously going on in the Austria of that period, couldn't be, of all sorts, but one didn't talk about it. It isn't like today where everything is explicit. You just didn't talk about certain things. Now, there's a whole sequence in the notebooks where Wittgenstein gets a leave and goes with his lieutenant to Vienna, where after all, he would get to see his family and be at his beautiful house and so on. He went to visit them very briefly, and we don't know what he did the rest of the time. It isn't brought out at all, but it's very odd that he's there that long, 4 days or something, long weekend, let's say. And then there are also remarks about not getting along with a certain person. I mean, I'm sure that, but why didn't he talk about it? Well, here's the most interesting thing, and this isn't directly in the notebooks. I don't talk about this, but I will here. Wittgenstein made a famous confession later in the 30s to his friends at Cambridge. I want to become a better person. I want to become a really, be proud of myself, to become a better person, to change, to become a different person. And in his confession, he did confess to them that he felt guilty that he had pretended not to be Jewish, that he hid his Jewishness, which, by the way, is another way that he is an outsider, of course, in England and in us, and he should confess that. But he never confesses anything about his sexuality, that even in the confession, he evidently felt he certainly couldn't talk about his private life, because that's just something one didn't talk about. And he wasn't the only one who didn't talk about it. It's just something one wouldn't. There have been things, a lot of things now written about it, but, and I don't think we need to dwell on it here. I think
No,
there
no,
are
no.
other things, we don't need to really dwell on it here. But I think there's just the general feeling that you do certain things, but those are things you don't talk about. But I don't think there's any doubt that he was in fact gay. There's never any interest, let's put it the other way around, negatively, in women. So when you say he was just troubled by sexuality, well, what does that really mean? And it wasn't in Wittgenstein's case, because we know who all the people were. The first person he was in love with was Pinsent, who he talks about all the time in the notebooks. I miss Davy. I finally got a letter from Davy. Of course, there are the other sides, or the opposite sides of the war. I finally got a letter from David. David Pinsent was a student at Cambridge when Wittgenstein was first at Dawn, so he was just a little older than he was. I finally got a letter from David. I kissed the letter. I kissed the envelope. I don't think most people say that just offhand, about friends. And it meant everything to him. And then David was killed in an airplane incident. And so on. I think that was a chaste relationship. Wittgenstein was still very young, but he obviously was in love with David. David was the person he wanted to hear from. It meant much more than getting letters from Mama or, Hermina, his sister, and so on. So that is a big factor in his life.
Mhm.
And I think in his work too.
Okay, so there is, to use a lawyer's terminology, there is some circumstantial evidence, as it were, if one considers the background you just described. Right. Okay. Well, no, I mean, the reason I mentioned it was because, for example, he himself talks about why he goes to the cafes, because he likes the respectable atmosphere there. Right, that's as he reveals later on. And I mean, I didn't as such, think when I was reading this that there was something else, another reason. I mean, he wasn't like Thomas Mann, who would like to go to cafes and look at handsome waiters, for example.
No, it's not like Thomas Mann. Yeah.
No. All right. Okay, we've got time for one more question, perhaps before we open the floor to other questions. Yes, you write that throughout his life, Wittgenstein's aim to turn into a different person was paramount, and that the war, with all its challenges and difficulties, allowed him to do that. Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah.
What role did the war play? I mean, he did say himself, yes, it saved my life. I don't know what I would have done without it, which is an odd thing to say.
Well, it isn't all that odd if you think about it this way. He was very sheltered. He led a very sheltered life. They had tutors, he wasn't a particularly good student. So his father sent him to Realschule rather than Gymnasium in Linz, and where Hitler was there, Hitler's birthplace, and they were at the school actually at the same time. Fuss is made about that, but they never met, actually. But Wittgenstein, it was a very austere person, like Simone Weil in a way. They have that in common, the kind of austerity and the idea of being authentic. Authenticity is very important. And he was religious. That was one of your other questions. I'll come to that now. I write about that actually in the last chapter, the postface of my book, Edge of Irony, which is about the war, the writers of the war period, like Joseph Roth and Musil, etc. And Musil, of course, is somebody who relates very much to Wittgenstein. He not specifically, he loved the Gospels. He loved the Sermon on the Mount, and he refers often, again and again, in various conversations to the Gospels and what they meant to him. Now, when he was on the ship, they docked at one point in a little Polish town, and he went into the bookstore. And of course, he couldn't read most of the books in Polish, but he found Tolstoy's Gospel in German. And that book meant a great deal to him. But if you read Tolstoy's Gospel, it's actually a way of moralizing the Bible. In other words, what Tolstoy does is he takes all the Bible stories and parables and turns them into only moral. He cuts off the religious element and turns them into moral tales, tales of moral rectitude. The funny thing is, Wittgenstein said he didn't quite like that, because for him, he didn't want to cut off the spiritual part and the possible meanings. And so I would say that although he was born Jewish, they were baptized, they had catechism classes. That didn't rub off so much, and he didn't like St. Paul. So his religion works this way. Paul was for him already much too doctrinaire, too legalistic, too set in certain ways. He liked much more the actual Gospels, actual, because of the mystery and the uncertainty and the feeling that you have to work things through, but it's always a mystery. You don't know. Now, why did the war mean so much? Well, in the war, he was thrown on his own devices. He wasn't with people of his kind, or even the British of his kind, like the philosophers at Cambridge, but with people he otherwise would never have spoken to, probably. And he had to make it somehow. And he felt, it's very romantic, and nobody would feel that way, I think, much today, that he wanted to prove himself. Of course, you still had hand-to-hand warfare of a kind you just don't have anymore, that he had to prove himself. And so he always asked to be on the front lines, and he didn't always get put on the front lines. But finally, in the so-called Brusilov offensive in the Carpathian Mountains, he was put on the front line and was first made to watch the watchtower. And he was very proud of the fact that he could do it. Then he was given leave. He was wounded. And that's when he was met Engelmann, one of his then later best friends. And he was very proud of the fact, and he did get some medals, that he could manage to fight and do what he was told to do, and that he was brave enough to do that. He felt that was very important. But beyond that, he felt it was very important to be very self-critical. And one of the reasons I guess I've always loved Wittgenstein is now he can laugh at himself in a certain way, and he's always more critical of himself than he is of anybody else, and is willing to say, I've got to change. This isn't right. It's not good. I should try harder and be better. So it's sort of the opposite of what we have today. In other words, today where everything is a matter of community and being communal and being part of the community and doing things in general, Wittgenstein didn't care about that. It's very individualistic, but he felt you can't improve everybody and you can't really change the world. It's not going to work. Everything is too awful, and the world is running down. He felt very much the Spenglerian force of our century is, a rundown of everything, but that you can at least make yourself a better person and be more honest and deal with people more directly. And he felt the war helped him do that. So when the war was over, the first thing he did was give away all his money. And in an almost crazy way, you could say, because his siblings, he gave it to his siblings and let them divide it up. And they said, but you're going to need it sometime. Are you sure you want to do this? Because he was very used to hiring a train or doing whatever he wanted to do. And he then lived a kind of ascetic life in Cambridge. He had one room, he had no furniture, he had one deck chair or two, and, bed, and he lived very frugally. And because he thought it was very important not to care about the things money buys. He had given a big gift to the Brenner, the magazine, the journal, the Brenner, and its editor, to give to various poets. The money went to Trachel, Rilke, picked by the editor of the Brenner, not by Wittgenstein, because he really didn't know, but he was very happy he was able to do that. But after that, after he gave his money away, he lived this kind of ascetic life in Cambridge or wherever he was, and the cottage, which was completely a tiny cottage, and because he felt that dealing with money corrupts. It's just going to corrupt and it takes up time, and I don't want to do that. So he really did lead the life what shall I say, not a saint, but a very ascetic life on the whole. Yes, there was the sex life underneath, but that's something you needed, but that you didn't really talk about. Although these letters to Ben Richards will disprove that a little bit. And wanted to become, as he always said, a different person. And by that he meant different from his Viennese family. Not that he didn't approve of them in certain ways, but he didn't really want to be like them. And he wanted to get away from that Viennese social world, which was quite materialistic, of course, even though it was also very cultural and so on. So that's the answer I think to that question.
Thank you so much, Marjorie, also for mentioning again the importance of Tolstoy. I just want to add one or two little addenda before we take some questions. One thing I suppose one should mention in this connection with his deepening engagement with religious issues. Of course, there was Tolstoy, but of course, prior to that, he was already reading William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, which contains at least a couple of chapters, I think, about conversion stories. And these involve people who are at death's door. They come face to face with death, and then something happens. And so Wittgenstein was very much impressed with those sorts of stories as well, and perhaps often hoping then that the war might offer him a similar opportunity, right, to change his life around. And the other thing, of course, in connection with this is that when David Pinson visited him in Norway, and they had a good time there, and David said, Wittgenstein is jolly good company when he's in a good mood, but he's been depressed of late because he thinks he's going to die before he's adequately dealt with Russell's theory of types. And then he says in one of his entries, this is David Pinson now, he's always saying that he's certain he will die within 4 years, but today it was 2 months. And then I will just leave you one final entry on, this was September 1913, just a few months before he joined the war. He talked again tonight about his death, that he was not really afraid to die, but yet frightfully worried not to let the few remaining moments of his life be wasted. It all hangs on his absolutely morbid and mad conviction that he's going to die soon. There's no obvious reason that I could see why he should not live yet for a long time. But it is no use trying to dispel that conviction or his worries about it by reason. The conviction and the worry he can't help, for he is mad. That's what David Pinson said, and this was in 1913. So it's a curious mixture, isn't it, of motives?
Well, may
Suicide.
I say something? Yeah. Well, I think the reason he thought he was going to die, and all his life was thinking that is, after all, having had those brothers who committed suicide, death was very close. And that was true, first of all, also, I think in Viennese society, suicide was much more common than it would be in our society, for a variety of reasons. And that he might die. I think he was very morbid. He was often very depressed. And that's the conflict in Wittgenstein. He's completely conflicted and completely oppositional, just as, the maybe apocryphal story, but that he said to the landlady right before he died, tell them I've had a wonderful life. Yes. After complaining and being miserable, and everything is terrible, tell them I've had a wonderful life. Well, which is it? Well, it's not one or the other. He veers back and forth between these things all the time. And sometimes when he worked well, then he was quite happy. But I would say on the whole, yeah, he's very easily depressed and feeling that he can't carry out his work and it's no good anyway. None of it is any good. That kind of mood. So he is like that, a kind of Hamlet-like character in that way. And certainly not, you would say, very cheerful. Anyway.
Yes. Yeah. Bertrand Russell, by the way, and he observed the same thing just a couple of months after the entry I just read. He said, well, the problem with Wittgenstein is he's not satisfied with anything unless it's perfect. And I'm
There you
convinced he's going to commit suicide by February, he says.
Yes, wanting to be perfect. And of course, you can't be perfect. And I see one of the questions asked about the word anständig. He
Yeah.
wanted to be anständig, which means decent. Well, what does it mean to be a decent person? I think he means especially not being hypocritical. I think he
Yes.
hated hypocrisy and not pretending to be something one can't be, and to be frank, which was very unpleasant because he would say terrible things to people. And when he was a school teacher in southern
yes.
Austria, in Kirchberg and so forth, where he boxed the girls' ears, and he was very rude to some of the students and called them idiots and so forth, because he would say what he really thought, and he was very frank. So anständig can be looked at various ways. Everybody wasn't so happy with the fact that he was frank, and some people just thought he was insufferable. And we all might have thought, if you had to deal with him in daily life, that he was fairly insufferable. Certainly to women, he was pretty insufferable. I think, they don't really know anything and so on. So he wasn't exactly a model in that way at all. So it's interesting that people have warmed up to it. I'd actually like to read a quote that somebody put on Facebook, whom I don't know, but he's a Facebook friend, about the relation to Simone Weil since,
All right.
And this is Jacques-André Villiers. He wrote, Simone Weil could be an auspicious foil to Wittgenstein. They both were idealists, him giving away his inheritance, she going to work entry level at a Renault factory. They both wrote with aphoristic intensity. We haven't talked about style here at all, but that's absolutely true. These incredible aphorisms. Compare his terser sayings to her sayings collected in the volume Gravity and Grace. At times, her voice in that book sounds like it could be Ludwig's unwitting sister. Of what one cannot speak, we must be silent, he wrote in Tractatus. Yet for eons, the poets from the time of the Delphic oracle, in a through line to Ashbery and Stevens, Wallace Stevens, have indeed sought to write what we cannot write, what resists meaning almost successfully. I fear Ludwig would be tempted to exclude us from his ideal state in his astringent severity. Their lives were both sorts of poems. Each had poetic form, including Weil with the tragic self-starvation in World War II, and Wittgenstein, who still died too young, but very much with peace and gratitude. I thought that was very well put.
Yes.
I thought that was a very interesting comment.
Thank you so much. All right, Ron.
So we have 6 questions, one of which from David Levy that you've already addressed. But let's see if we can move through some of these with the time left to us. One by Jurek Kutnik, who asks in part, how German or Austrian is Wittgenstein's thinking, and how German is his notion of reality?
Good question. Very good question. Well, of course, it is a very different world from the British world. It is much less, how can I say, self-protective. I mean, the English at Cambridge and the way people behaved was very proper in a certain way. And on the other hand, much franker. This is the funny thing. Wittgenstein hated Bloomsbury, the Bloomsburys. Now you would think, well, he would like them. Virginia Woolf, Lytton Strachey, and that circle was practically all homosexual. It was one of the big things. And Keynes was a good friend of his. John Maynard Keynes, the great economist, was his one friend in that group. But when Bertrand Russell introduced him to the Bloomsburys and got him into the can't think of the name now, the great club, the Apostles, very elite, very hard to get into group of intellectuals, he dropped out right away, couldn't stand it, because they were always frankly sitting around talking about gossiping about each other's sex life and talking about who was sleeping with whom, Duncan Grant, Roger Fry, and so on. And he thought that was disgusting and say, you don't do that. You don't talk that way. So it's more a matter of what, not so much just purely linguistic as what the norms are for how you speak. And on the other hand, German is such a different language. And it comes out shorter than English when you translate. And he was very Germanic in a certain way, his whole upbringing, his sisters, the whole way they were taught things and learned things, and a kind of absolutism, I would say. For instance, all right, this composer is herrlich. Beethoven, Brahms, of course, those are the great composers. He knew Brahms, came to the Wittgenstein house, but there wasn't any discussion about it. That was just great, and that was it. There wasn't even as much discussion as there would be in England. I mean, it's hard to put your finger on it. It's just manners, really, in a certain way, how you act with other people. Now, for instance, Wittgenstein was very friendly with the great literary critic F.R. Leavis. They used to go for walks together in Cambridge. And F.R. Leavis writes in his memoirs that Wittgenstein didn't know anything about English literature, or didn't know anything about literature, didn't seem to know much about literature. Well, that's because he didn't know English literature, because of course that was not his literature, and he didn't adore Shakespeare. That seemed amazing to all his British friends. How can one not love Shakespeare, the greatest of all writers? But it was too remote for Wittgenstein. In German, things really heat up only in the 18th century with Lessing and then Goethe and so forth. You don't have literature in the 16th century for just national historical reasons. And so Shakespeare was, for him, he said, too remote. It didn't have the human problems that he felt, I mean, the immediate psychological problems. So that for him, Shakespeare would never be as important as Goethe was. And in general, he had no use particularly for the British. I mean, he never read Jane Austen or anything like that. But that didn't mean he didn't know anything about literature. He just knew a very different literature, like Gottfried Keller, De Grüne Heinrich. Those are the books that he would have known. So there's lots written about that isn't really quite right. And in fact, when William Empson showed him a poem and said, I don't know what this means, can you explain it to me? I'm sorry, when Leavis looked at one of William Empson's poems, Wittgenstein went through it and got it just like that. But he always said that the English world was very alien to him. He couldn't really understand it. He couldn't understand the manners and the morals because they were so different from what he was used to. And it's much too long to go into all that now. And by the way, you have in the great book on Wittgenstein's Vienna is Alan, just a blank. Alan, what's his last name? So famous.
Alan Yannick, is it?
I know Yannick, thank you. It's a friend of mine. Alan Yannick and Stephen Toulmin, and Alan Yannick has done revisions of it too. That gives you a good sense of that world. But it's a world that's just very different because given to much greater extremes than the polite Cambridge world would have been. And Russell writes about that very interestingly when he first meets Wittgenstein. He calls him Herr Sinkelfinkel, and he gives him various names like that. And he said he appears at my door at 2 a.m. and wants to talk, very abrupt, and says, can we discuss this? We haven't figured out this problem, and you've got it wrong. That kind of thing. Now, you could say that was just his own personality, but he also didn't think anything of being that. It was a more classist society than England is a class society too at the time. But I would say in Austria, there's a kind of ruling class. There's what's called the Second Society, which was this great Austro-Jewish cultural wealthy society between the wars, but they had nothing to do with people of the lower class. And that's very different.
Yeah. Just one tiny correction. Carl Britton, who used to teach at Swansea in Wales at one point, he actually caught Wittgenstein reading Jane Austen at one point.
Oh, okay.
He asked him, what are you reading? What are you reading? He said, well, and he said, well, does any woman actually talk like that? Wittgenstein is reported to have said. So he didn't like it much, but anyway.
No, and I don't think he read George Eliot, but I'm interested to know that he actually did try to read Jane Austen. Yeah, he knew, he has I wrote a piece on Wittgenstein and Shakespeare, and he loved some of it, but he didn't like the comedies. He just didn't get those. The comedies, they were too unlike his kind of sense of thinking, and that whole sense of comedy was not him. Now, the question is that Jurek asked is language as a system humans have for communication, or Wittgenstein's German, how German or Austrian is Wittgenstein's thinking? Well, it isn't, I mean, Austria is a very different country from Germany, not today, less so, but it certainly was at the time. Always bear in mind that you have the empire, and in the empire, many languages are spoken: Hungarian, Serb, Czech, of course, Czech, loads of Czechs in Vienna too. So it's this polyglot world that Wittgenstein first grew up in, and but it wasn't German. And in fact, they really hated German. And Wittgenstein has never been very popular, by the way. I think, Mara, am I wrong? In Germany, much less than in other countries. I mean, the French have all kinds of, by the way, I should say that these notebooks have been translated into French much earlier in the 90s by Jean-Pierre Comedy and translated into Spanish. There's a very good Spanish edition, and there's an Italian edition done by one of the leading Italian philosophers, has very good notes and so forth. So he's very popular in Italy. If you go to Kirchberg am Wechsel, there are always a lot of Italians. But in Germany, I think he never quite caught on because it is so unlike German, so very unlike in many ways German philosophy.
Speaking of translations, and Rebecca, if we can get copies of some of the questions that I'm not going to be able to get to, and perhaps we can have them afterwards emailed to Marjorie, so in case she might like to respond to any of them. But I want to turn, in the time we have left, David Levy had a question.
Reading it, yeah.
And in part, and forgive me, David, he says, why do you think that Wittgenstein's German writing of the time consisted in concepts that were not those that he had learned in Cambridge? If so, isn't the translation correct? He said, he notes at the beginning that he had some problems. He was puzzled by your remarks that you had problems with Ramsey's translation, which he notes Wittgenstein had reviewed the translation at length prior to publication.
I know that.
You have a comment on that?
Yes, this kind of thing is often brought up, and it's brought up today about translations all the time. The person from the original language may very much approve of the translation. He's happy to be translated, and his own English isn't that good. So he thinks the translation is just fine. And only somebody bilingual in a way, which I am in that sense, can really see that's not quite the case. Now, you can say he learned the terminology. Certainly the terminology of logic, he didn't use till he got it from Russell and got it in English and responds to it in English. But after all, later, for instance, the whole notion of the language game, there's nothing of that in Russell. And already in the notebooks, when you get to the third notebook, and you do have on the right side of the page, the questions like, the world, the sense of the world must lie outside the world. These famous statements, or everything we see could also be otherwise. I mean, they have nothing particularly to do with logic that he learned at Cambridge. And I'm not talking so much about words as about syntax. And that's where the big difference is. His syntax is very different from English syntax. For instance, adverbial phrases in German are often at the beginning of the sentence, where we tend to put them at the end, at the second part. And as somebody who studies poetry, syntax is very important. So when things are translated, I mean, he did say them. Let's say the famous phrase, which is in the note, the lectures, Cambridge lectures of 1931 or 2, all that is not gas is grammar. All that is not gas is grammar. All that is not bullshit in a way is grammar. And grammar is so terribly important. Now, I'm sure he did say that because this is a recorded lecture, all that is not gas. But I think he would have wanted it, and there is no German equivalent for that there because he said it in English. But I think it's a peculiar way to use gas. I mean, it's too, gas is sort of somehow doesn't quite fit there. I don't know what word would have been better, but it gives you an impression that isn't quite like the way he writes. And if you read the letters that are in English, when he wrote to Russell, of course, he wrote in English. When he wrote to Keynes, he wrote in English. But it's a kind of stilted English. It sounds Victorian. Now you can argue, okay, it should be like the English of his time. This is an argument we can't deal with here. It's always the question, if we have a Chekhov play, should we have a translation that translates Chekhov into the English of its period or of our period? And the usual feeling is, as you know, with retranslations of Proust and so forth, that you tend to do it for your own generation in a way. And the language changes so much because otherwise it may be anachronistic. But that can be argued either way, clearly. It's just that one should be aware of it. And I guess what bothers me a little bit is that the usual way of treating Wittgenstein, let's say in college courses or whatever, is just, I mean, I know somebody who's written a whole book on Wittgenstein who doesn't know a word of German, or anything relating to that, which after all is a lot of the material, and they just sort of take him as an English writer and an English philosopher, and that's a little wrong.
Marjorie,
Anyway,
forgive me again. The clock time is not on our side.
sorry.
Maybe we can get one more question. We only have about four minutes to go. Steve Fennell asks, what influence did you have on the world as I found it? What influence did it have on your work on Wittgenstein?
The World as I Found It is a novel by Bruce Duffy, who recently died, who was a student of mine at the University of Maryland. And what's amazing about that book is he never went to Europe. He certainly doesn't read German, and he makes a lot of it up. Now, people love that book, and it is, in a way, a fascinating novel. And certainly I had an influence on it to a small degree, but in those years, I wasn't reading Wittgenstein much. But did it have an influence on me? No, I wouldn't particularly say so, but it's a very intriguing novel. The New York Review of Books reprinted it not so long ago, and it's great on stories about Lady Ottilie Morell and Bertrand Russell and their affair and how strange Wittgenstein was. But what Bruce does manage to do in a very odd way for somebody who's not part of that world at all, is he does sort of capture Wittgenstein's stubbornness and austerity, and how in a certain way he was like a monk, and in other ways very different from that. The contradictions. I mean, I think the reason literary people love Wittgenstein in that way is because he is so contradictory. You cannot straighten many of these things out, nor should you even try. He's opposite in many ways, like this attitude toward death and suicide and life. And so you just have to take it that way, that it is amazing to have somebody with such contradictory traits who in a way contradicts himself, but that's how you think. And we really haven't talked today much about his thought. I'm a little sorry. I hope you will do more in that, because the reason it's so interesting is it won't let you take anything for granted. You have to work it out. And philosophy is not a product, but a process. And it's a way of thinking. And once you get that way of thinking, political writings and so on take on a very different edge, because you realize that you just can't say certain things.
Before we pull the curtain, Mario, would you like to make just a closing statement, and then I'll end things?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to, for the listeners, to point out that there's a very interesting book coming out very soon. I think it may be in April now. Wittgenstein and the Vienna Circle, 100 years after the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, in which Marjorie also has a chapter entitled In Search of the Redeeming Word, Wittgenstein's Private Notebooks, 1914 to 16, and the Making of the Tractatus. So that would be something else for our listeners. I think that'd be of great interest to read alongside the translation.
Yes, this is edited by Friedrich Stadler. It was a conference, and now the conference papers have been published, so it's similar to the book. I mean, and no pretense, it's a sketch for certain things, but there's some very interesting, and that of course is a whole other fascinating chapter, the relation to the Vienna Circle.
Yes, exactly.
Wittgenstein really didn't like them, but they liked him. He did not much care for them. I mean, there's no doubt he was in his own way, a very difficult person. And to me, very endearing, just in all this doubt and all these, asking all these questions, because it's so unique, in its articulation.
So many things left to be
Yeah,
said.
sorry. Yeah. Well, but we covered quite a lot of ground. Mario, thank you. We covered quite a lot.
Mario and with my colleague Eric Springstead and our other members of our board, we'll have to talk about how we might see that some form of this exchange might be continued either in print or video. We'll explore that in the coming weeks. I will say, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here, Marjorie, and truth is my defense. You were a woman with remarkable energy, and what a wonderful exchange it is. And thank you so much for joining us today. And as is our custom, will everybody please unmute themselves and join with me in extending a warm hand of appreciation to you. Thank you so much, Marjorie.
Thank
Indeed.
you.
Thank you.
I hope you can send me the questions. Can you send me the questions? Because they look very interesting.
Yes, Rebecca, if you will just help me with that and getting those questions, and we'll see that they get out
I'd love to have them.
to
Yeah.
you. And then if we can get the email addresses from some of the people who wrote in.
That would be
we'll
wonderful.
back to
Thank
them.
you. Thank
So-
you very much, Ron, for doing it.
Let the dialogue continue, but that will be for tomorrow. For today, thank you, whatever part of the world you're in, for joining us today. Goodbye.